How is everyone doing today? I hope you are all well, and if you are not, I hope things get better for you soon. Welcome back to the channel. I've got a true story for you today. It is strange, it is dark, and it is mysterious. And it details the terrifying events that occurred in one of the most remote, utterly isolated ghost towns in North America, Kennecott, Alaska, a town frozen in time, haunted not just by history, but by the powerful, vengeful curse of the copper mine itself. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Go down into the comment section and let me know. I always enjoy seeing how far the strange, dark, and mysterious family extends. Now, let's get into the story. Our narrative takes us back to the far northern frontier of Alaska, high up in the Wrangell Street Elias National Park, to a ghost town named Kennecott. Kennecott was once a booming, thriving mining camp built almost entirely around a massive copper deposit discovered in the early 1900s. It was an industrial marvel, accessible only by a single winding railroad track deep in a wilderness defined by immense glaciers and towering, impossibly cold mountains. The town was abandoned abruptly in 1938 when the copper ran out. The company packed up its operations, but rather than removing the buildings, they simply locked the doors and walked away. The result is a perfectly preserved, silent industrial town of colossal wooden structures, mill buildings, and processing facilities, all left at the mercy of the brutal Alaskan winters. The entire place is a frozen monument to greed and haste. Our story focuses on a team of 3 civilian engineers and 1 historian hired by the National Park Service in the early 1990s. Their mission was straightforward: assess the structural integrity of the massive mill building, the largest wooden structure in Alaska, before the Park Service could begin preservation efforts. They were essentially historians of decay. The team consisted of Dr. Aaron Wells, the lead engineer, and an expert in cold weather physics. Ben and Lisa, 2 structural technicians, and Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, who was obsessed with the strange, short, and wildly profitable history of the Kennecott mine. The team arrived in late October. The last bush plane dropped them off, promising to return in exactly 2 weeks. They were equipped with satellite phones, generators, and enough high-tech monitoring gear to stabilize a small skyscraper. The atmosphere in Kennecott was immediately unsettling. The town felt utterly, profoundly silent. The immense wooden mill building, 12 stories high, built into the side of the glacier, loomed over them like a massive sleeping beast. Everything was covered in a deep layer of dust and ice. Dr. Gray, the historian, quickly uncovered the source of the town's strange, dark, and mysterious energy. She found old, local rumors that suggested the Kennecott copper deposit was not a natural occurrence. The local Athabascan tribes had long warned against mining that specific mountain, claiming it was the heart of the sleeping stone, and that the rich copper veins were the frozen metal blood of a powerful, ancient mountain spirit. Taking the copper, they warned, would result in a terrible, slow, and specific curse upon the thieves. Dr. Wells, the engineer, dismissed this as folklore. He was focused on the mill building. As they began their structural analysis, they discovered something physically impossible. The massive wooden beams and supporting trusses that made up the enormous structure were not simply cold. They registered an internal temperature several degrees lower than the external air temperature. The wood was actively, aggressively cold, acting as a massive heat sink, drawing energy out of the air. "It's thermodynamic nonsense," Wells muttered, checking his sensors. "The wood is radiating cold. It's colder than the ice it's built into." Over the next few days, the team began to feel the effects of this impossible cold. Their high-tech generators constantly stalled. Their batteries drained at an unnatural rate. The temperature inside their own heated cabin remained stubbornly frigid. Then, the phenomena became more focused and terrifying. Ben, the structural technician, was working alone on the 7th floor of the mill, installing a stress monitor onto a massive beam. He was wearing thick gloves and a heavy parka. Suddenly, he heard a sound, not a human sound, but the sound of heavy, dry, rhythmic metal grinding, as if the huge, silent, ore-crushing machinery deep in the mill's basement had inexplicably roared to life. Ben froze, listening. The sound was followed by a sharp, clear voice, not from the radio, but originating from the hollow wooden walls right next to him. The voice was deep, resonant, and spoke in perfect, clear English, yet it sounded like gravel being scraped against steel. The voice said simply, "Thief." Return the blood. Ben threw his tools and scrambled down the 12 flights of stairs in a blind panic. When he reached the bottom, he found the other members of the team, who had heard nothing but Ben's screams echoing in the vast empty structure. Wells, the lead engineer, still insisted on a logical explanation: resonant frequencies, structural settling, wind noise, but he couldn't explain the voice. Dr. Gray, however, knew. She had found a specific reference in the old mine logs. The local Athabascan legend warned that the curse of the Heart of the Sleeping Stone was not aimed at their lives, but at their warmth and their tools. The spirit would not kill them directly, but would slowly, methodically, freeze their very purpose, their machines, their power, and their will until they succumbed to the mountain's cold. The most bizarre, dark, and mysterious event occurred the next night. The team was huddled in their cabin, afraid to leave. They heard the sound of footsteps outside. Not human footsteps, but a slow, heavy, rhythmic, dragging sound moving across the hard-packed ice right outside their windows. It sounded like something with immense, massive feet was slowly circling their cabin. Mike, the engineer, grabbed the high-powered thermal camera and looked out the window, pointing the lens into the darkness. What the camera showed defied everything Dr. Wells believed about physics. There was a figure outside the cabin, a colossal silhouette about 10 feet tall. But the creature was not hot or cold. It was perfectly, absolutely null. It registered 0 Kelvin, a terrifying, impossible temperature that showed up on the thermal camera as a blank, perfectly black void against the warm purple background of the snow. It was a zone of pure, absolute cold moving in the physical world. The creature was dragging something. The thermal camera captured the sight of a large, heavy, antique copper kettle being dragged across the ice. The kettle was radiating a fierce, localized heat, the only warm spot in the entire scene, glowing white-hot against the creature's cold blackness. As the creature stopped right outside their door, the voice, the grinding, gravelly voice, spoke again, inside their heads this time. "The warmth is mine. It leaves with the blood." The team understood the horrifying symbolism. The copper was the blood of the mountain, and the creature, the vengeful spirit, was collecting the copper and the heat energy it represented, storing it in the copper kettle before taking it back to the frozen core of the mill. Dr. Wells, abandoning all pretense of scientific objectivity, realized the only way to survive was to somehow break the curse's focus. They had 1 day left before the bush plane was due. They had to survive until morning. Wells developed a desperate plan. They had to return the source of the heat back to the mill, confusing the spirit's focus. The primary heat source in the cabin was their generator. They managed to haul the heavy, sputtering generator out onto the snow and dragged it toward the colossal mill building. The air grew impossibly cold as they neared the mill. The internal cold of the wood now actively attacking them. Their eyelids felt glued shut, and their lungs burned. As they approached the massive mill entrance, the sound of the metallic grinding began again, growing deafening. They saw the creature. It was standing at the threshold of the mill, its null-black form outlined by the dim moonlight. The copper kettle was sitting at its feet, radiating intense, pure heat. Wells, on the verge of collapse, pushed the sputtering generator over the threshold. The generator roared, spewing heat and exhaust into the cold air. The moment the generator's heat hit the ground, the creature reacted. It let out a single, piercing, non-acoustic shriek of pure, telepathic pain that knocked the team backward onto the ice. The mill building then reacted. The massive wooden structure, 12 stories of silent, dead timber, began to groan not from settling, but from immense internal effort. The internal temperature sensors, which they were still carrying, spiked violently, showing a sudden, catastrophic internal heat surge that should have instantly incinerated the building. The colossal structure was fighting itself, the generator's heat against the mountain's cold. The creature's null-black form dissolved instantly into a cloud of swirling, white, supercooled vapor. The copper kettle, now empty, rolled across the ice and shattered into 1,000 shards of brittle, frozen metal. When the snow settled, the mill was silent again. The internal heat surge vanished, returning the mill to its impossible cold. The generator was now silent, completely seized and frozen solid. The team staggered back to the cabin, barely alive. The next morning, the bush plane arrived. The pilots found the team severely frostbitten, nearly incoherent, but alive. The pilots reported an anomaly. The massive wooden mill building, which had stood perfectly preserved for decades, was now covered in thousands of tiny, microscopic fractures, fractures that were all concentrated around the massive support beams. The wood had been violently stressed, as if the mill had been momentarily twisted from the inside out. The team was evacuated. They all suffered permanent nerve damage from the cold exposure, and they all carried one permanent auditory injury, a continuous, faint internal tinnitus that sounded exactly like the low, rhythmic grinding of the silent copper mill. The official report blamed hypothermia and a localized mechanical failure for the team's distress. Dr. Wells, however, never practiced engineering again. He dedicated his life to researching the strange, dark, and mysterious relationship between geometry and heat. His final unpublished theory stated that the curse of Kennecott was the mountain's method of reversing entropy, actively cooling and freezing the remnants of the human endeavor, ensuring the mountain's time would never pass. The final dark postscript to the story. Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, years later, was monitoring the National Park Service's live stream from a camera placed high on the mountain overlooking the abandoned mill. The camera was running silently. One night, the camera captured something impossible. The enormous copper mill building, 12 stories of decaying wood, did not move. But the massive shadow it cast onto the glacier below suddenly and violently stretched and retracted, as if the mill were breathing a massive, silent, living heart, still sucking the heat from the world around it, waiting for the next brave souls to challenge the curse of the frozen copper mine. And that is where our story ends, with the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the true curse is not death, but the eternal, impossible, profound cold. If you enjoyed this strange, dark, and mysterious story, please consider hitting that like button, and if you are new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Today's story is about one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. Usually, when we talk about ghost ships, we are talking about folklore or legends from the 1800s, like the Flying Dutchman stories, that are half myth and half rumor. But today's story is about a real 1,300-ton steel cargo steamer, a ship that was abandoned by its crew, declared lost, and then proceeded to sail the Arctic Ocean alone, without a captain, without a crew, and without fuel for nearly 4 decades. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how a massive steel ship can become a ghost, we first have to go to the frozen edge of the world. We are going to the Canadian Arctic and the coast of Alaska. The year is 1931. The ship in question was called the SS Bechimo. She was a tough, sturdy vessel. Originally built in Sweden, she was purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company. If you know anything about the history of the North, you know the Hudson's Bay Company was the titan of the fur trade. They needed ships that could take a beating. The Bechimo was exactly that. She was built to smash through ice. Her hull was reinforced with thick steel. For 9 years, she was the workhorse of the Arctic, sailing from Vancouver up to the northern coast of Canada, delivering supplies to remote outposts and picking up valuable furs. The crew of the Bechimo was led by Captain John Cornwell. Cornwell was not a man who scared easily. He was a veteran of the ice. He knew the waters, he knew the weather, and he respected the dangers of the North. In the summer of 1931, the Bechimo set off on what was supposed to be a routine run. They sailed north, threading their way through the treacherous waters, stopping at various trading posts. The trip was successful. The hold was full of furs worth millions of dollars in today's money. They turned the ship around and began the long journey home to Vancouver. But the Arctic in 1931 had other plans. Winter came early that year. And when winter comes to the Arctic, it does not knock on the door. It kicks the door down. By late September, the weather turned violent. The temperature plummeted. The sky turned a bruised purple and black, and the ocean began to solidify. On October 1st, the Bechimo was near the tiny settlement of Barrow, Alaska. This is the northernmost point of the United States. The water around the ship began to thicken into what sailors call Brazil ice, a slush that signals the ocean is freezing. Within hours, the slush turned into hardpack ice. The Beichimo, despite her reinforced hull and powerful steam engine, began to slow down. The ice was not just floating on the surface, it was squeezing the ship. Imagine a vice grip made of millions of tons of white concrete. Captain Cornwell pushed the engines to full power. The ship shuddered. The metal groaned. But the ice was too thick. The Beichimo ground to a halt. She was trapped. At first, the crew was not panicked. This happened in the Arctic. You get stuck, you wait for a shift in the wind, the ice opens up, and you move. They waited for 2 weeks, but the ice did not open. It got worse. The pressure against the hull became immense. The ship started to list or tilt to one side. The crew could hear the rivets popping. It sounded like gunshots ringing out through the steel hull. On October 15th, Captain Cornwell made a difficult decision. He realized that if the ice crushed the ship suddenly, his crew would be trapped inside and dragged to the bottom. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. They did not go far. They walked about a half-mile across the frozen ocean to the solid ice near the shore of Barrow. They built a makeshift shelter, a wooden hut, so they could keep an eye on the ship. Their plan was to wait out the winter, or at least wait until the ship was crushed so they could salvage the expensive furs. So, you have this surreal scene. 30-plus sailors, shivering in a wooden shack on the ice, watching their massive ship sitting helpless in the distance, stuck in the white grip of the frozen ocean. For weeks, they watched. The ship moved a little bit as the ice shifted, but she remained trapped. Then, on November 24th, 1931, the weather went from bad to apocalyptic. A blizzard struck the area. This was not a normal snowstorm. This was a whiteout hurricane. The wind screamed at over 60 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees. The visibility was 0. If you held your hand out in front of your face, you could not see your fingers. The crew in the hut huddled together, praying the roof would not blow off. For 3 days, the storm raged. They could not leave the hut. They could not see the ship. They could only listen to the wind howling like a banshee. Finally, the storm broke. The wind died down. The sun, which was barely rising at this time of year, cast a pale light over the frozen ocean. Captain Cornwell and his men stepped out of the hut. They looked toward the spot where the Beichimo had been stuck for over a month. The spot was empty. There was nothing there, just a jagged ridge of pressure ice. Captain Cornwell stared at the empty horizon. His heart sank. He assumed the obvious. The blizzard and the pressure of the shifting ice had finally crushed the hull, and the Beichimo had sunk to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, taking the fortune in furs with her. The crew was devastated, but they were also resigned. The sea takes what it wants. They packed up their meager belongings and prepared to be rescued by planes that were scheduled to fly them out now that the cargo was lost. But just a few days later, a local Inuit hunter arrived at their camp. He looked confused. He asked Captain Cornwell, "Why are you still here? Why aren't you on your ship?" Cornwell looked at him and said, "My ship sank. It's gone." The hunter shook his head. "No," he said. "It didn't sink. I just saw it. It is floating about 45 miles away to the south." Cornwell was stunned. 45 miles? How could a ship move 45 miles through solid ice in the middle of a blizzard without a crew? Cornwell gathered a few of his men, and they took dog sleds to the location the hunter had described. Sure enough, there she was, the SS Beichimo. She was sitting crookedly in the ice, looking like a ghost. She was covered in snow, rigging frozen, but she was very much afloat. Cornwell boarded the ship. He expected to find it leaking and ruined. But miraculously, the ship was intact. The hull had not been breached. However, Cornwell made a calculation. He looked at the damage to the rudder, he looked at the winter setting in, and he decided that the ship was not seaworthy enough to be sailed back to civilization. He figured it was only a matter of time before she actually sank. So, the crew frantically unloaded the most valuable furs, about half the cargo, and loaded them onto sleds. They worked until they were exhausted. Then, For the second time, Captain Cornwell abandoned the Bechimo. He left her to die. He assumed that within a week she would be at the bottom of the sea. Captain Cornwell was wrong. This was the moment the SS Bechimo ceased to be a normal ship and became a legend, because the Bechimo did not sink. Instead, she began a journey that would defy the laws of probability. Months passed. Spring arrived in 1932. A dog sledder was traveling near the coast of Herschel Island, hundreds of miles east of where the ship was abandoned. He looked out at the water, and he saw a strange shape drifting in the fog. He got closer. It was a massive, rusty steamship. It was drifting silently, aimlessly. There was no smoke coming from the stack, no lights on the deck. It was the Bechimo. She had survived the winter alone. This was just the beginning. Over the next few years, reports started flooding in from all over the Arctic. Inuit hunters, explorers, and traders would report seeing the ghost ship of the Arctic. Sometimes she was stuck in the ice, looking like a monument. Sometimes she was drifting freely in open water, moving against the current as if she were being steered by an invisible hand. In 1933, 2 years after she was abandoned, a group of indigenous Alaskans and some fur trappers spotted the ship drifting near the coast. It was a calm day. They decided to board her. They thought, hey, there is still cargo on this ship. There are supplies. There is valuable equipment. They paddled their small boats out to the steel giant. They climbed up the rusted ladder. The deck was eerie. It was perfectly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cables. They went below deck. It was like a time capsule. There were plates on the tables in the mess hall. There were books in the captain's quarters. There were still bales of fur in the hold. But while they were inside exploring, the Arctic weather turned on them. A sudden, violent storm blew in out of nowhere. The wind picked up and the ice began to move. The trappers realized they could not get back to their small boats. The waves were too high, and the ice floes were smashing against the hull. They were trapped. For 10 days, these men were prisoners on the ghost ship. Imagine the terror. You are trapped on a derelict vessel that has been drifting for 2 years. You have no idea where it is going. You have no idea if the hull is about to snap in half. You are drifting blindly into the dark, freezing ocean. They survived by eating the canned food that had been left in the galley back in 1931. They slept in the crew's bunks, listening to the metal groan and shriek as the ice squeezed the ship. They must have wondered if the ghosts of the crew were watching them. Finally, after 10 agonizing days, the storm broke. The ship drifted close enough to a large ice floe that the men were able to jump off and walk back to land. They left empty-handed, terrified, and happy to be alive. The Bechimo drifted away again, as if she had just wanted company for a few days. You would think that eventually someone would salvage this ship. I mean, it is a 1,300-ton vessel worth a fortune. In 1939, 8 years after the abandonment, a daring captain named Hugh Poulsen spotted the Bechimo. Captain Poulsen was a man of action. He saw the ship and said, I am going to bring her in. He maneuvered his own ship next to the ghost ship. He managed to get towing cables attached to her bow. This was it. The Bechimo was finally going to be captured. But the Bechimo seemed to have a will of its own. As soon as Poulsen began to tow her, the ice moved in. It was almost targeted. Massive blocks of jagged ice began to slam into Poulsen's ship. The tow lines pulled tight, threatening to capsize his vessel. The ice was closing in so fast that Poulsen realized he had a choice. He could cut the Bechimo loose, or he could go down with her. With a heavy heart, Poulsen ordered his crew to take axes and chop the tow lines. The cables snapped with a sound like a whip crack. The Bechimo drifted free, disappearing into the white mist. It was almost as if the ship was mocking him. She refused to be owned. She refused to be saved. The years rolled on. 1940, 1945, 1950. The world changed. World War II happened. Man invented the atomic bomb, jets started flying in the sky, and through it all, the SS Bechimo kept sailing. She became a part of the landscape. Pilots flying over the Arctic would look down and see her, a rusty brown speck in a world of white. She was seen off the coast of Alaska. She was seen in the Beaufort Sea. She was seen near the Chukchi Sea. She covered thousands of miles, zigzagging back and forth, defying every prediction of naval architects who said she should have sunk decades ago. How was this possible? How can a steel ship survive the crushing power of the Arctic ice for that long without maintenance? Theories abound. Some say she was just lucky, always finding the path of least resistance. Others say she was light in the water because the heavy cargo had been removed, allowing her to ride up on top of the ice rather than being crushed by it. And of course, the locals began to whisper that the ship was cursed or possessed, steered by the spirits of the North who wanted to keep her as a trophy. The final confirmed sighting of the SS Beit-Shimo happened in 1969. Think about that. 1969. That is the year humans walked on the moon. That is 38 years after she was abandoned. A group of Inuit hunters in the Beaufort Sea saw the ship. She was frozen in a large pack of ice, looking more like a part of the iceberg than a ship. She was rusted, battered, and beaten, but she was still upright. She was still there. After 1969, she vanished. No one has seen her since. In 2006, the Alaskan government launched a project to find the ghost ship of the Arctic. They used sonar, they checked satellite imagery, and they scoured the ocean floor in the areas where she was last seen. They wanted to solve the mystery once and for all. They found nothing. No wreckage. No hull. No debris field. So, where is the Beit-Shimo? Logic dictates that she finally succumbed to the sea. Maybe in a massive storm in the early 1970s, she finally took on too much water and slipped beneath the waves. She is likely resting on the muddy bottom of the Arctic Ocean, a rusted skeleton in the dark. But there are those who believe she is still out there. The Arctic is a vast, vast place. There are thousands of miles of uninhabited coastline. There are fjords and bays that no human eyes see for years at a time. It is technically possible, however unlikely, that the Beit-Shimo is still floating, or perhaps grounded on some lonely, frozen beach that isn't on any map, waiting for the ice to melt so she can sail again. The story of the Beit-Shimo is a reminder that we do not conquer nature, we just borrow space from it. Captain Cornwell thought he could sail the Arctic, and the Arctic took his ship and turned it into a ghost. For 38 years, that ship sailed alone. She weathered storms that would sink modern vessels. She navigated ice fields that would crush submarines. She did it without a human hand on the wheel. And if you are ever on a boat in the freezing waters north of Alaska and the fog rolls in thick and heavy and you see a dark shape drifting silently toward you, do not assume it is just an iceberg. It might be the Beit-Shimo, still refusing to die, still looking for a crew to take her home. Today's story is about a journey that was supposed to be a victory lap, but turned into a slow-motion nightmare. It is a story about the finest police officers in the world, men who were considered unbreakable, being slowly taken apart by the unforgiving silence of the Canadian North. It is a reminder that in the wild, confidence can be just as deadly as a bullet. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we first have to look at the man at the center of it. His name was Inspector Francis Fitzgerald. In 1910, Francis Fitzgerald was a legend in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. He was the kind of guy other cops wanted to be. He was handsome, he was tough, and he had spent his entire career in the Arctic. He had sailed the worst seas, arrested the most dangerous criminals, and traveled thousands of miles by dog sled. He was known as the man who never failed. Because of his stellar reputation, Fitzgerald was chosen for a prestigious assignment. Every winter, the mounted police did a patrol, a mail run from Fort McPherson, which is way up in the Northwest Territories, to Dawson City in the Yukon. This was not a walk in the park. It was a 475-mile trek through some of the most rugged, mountainous terrain on Earth. But for a man like Fitzgerald, it was routine. In fact, Fitzgerald didn't just want to do the patrol. He wanted to destroy the record. He wanted to make the trip faster than anyone had ever done it before. He selected his team carefully. He picked 3 men. First, there was Constable Richard Taylor. He was a powerhouse, a veteran woodsman who was fit and strong. Then there was Constable George Kinney. He was not as tough as Taylor, but he was reliable. Finally, there was Special Constable Sam Carter. Carter was an expert herdsman and a longtime resident of the North. So, you have four tough, experienced men. They had the best dogs. They had the best equipment. They were the dream team of the Arctic. But right before they left, there was a red flag. A massive red flag. A local indigenous guide offered to go with them. The route from Fort McPherson to Dawson City is tricky. There are hundreds of rivers and creeks that all look exactly the same. If you take one wrong turn, you end up in a dead end. Fitzgerald looked at the guide and shook his head. He said, "No thanks. I have a map, I have a compass, and I have Sam Carter. He knows the way." Fitzgerald was so confident in his ability to move fast that he made a critical calculation. He decided to travel light. He packed enough food for 30 days. The trip usually took roughly 30 to 40 days. He was cutting it razor thin because he assumed they would be flying across the snow. On December 21st, 1910, the four men and their three teams of 15 dogs set off from Fort McPherson. The temperature was a brisk 21 degrees below zero. The villagers waved goodbye, watching the lost patrol disappear into the white horizon. They expected to hear news of their record-breaking arrival in Dawson City in a few weeks. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The team was making incredible time. They were covering 20 miles a day. They laughed, they joked, and they camped under the northern lights. Fitzgerald felt validated. He didn't need a guide. He was the master of the North. But on New Year's Day, 1911, the luck ran out. A massive snowstorm hit. The trail, which was usually visible, was buried under feet of fresh powder. The landmarks were erased. Fitzgerald began to rely heavily on Sam Carter to navigate. But there was a problem. Sam Carter had only done this route once before, and it was 5 years ago, and he had done it in the opposite direction. The terrain started to look unfamiliar. They were searching for a specific river called the Little Wind River. It was the key to crossing the mountain range. Sam Carter looked at a frozen creek and said, "This is it. This is the turn." Fitzgerald checked his map. It didn't look quite right, but he trusted his man. He trusted the experience. So the patrol turned right, heading up a steep, winding canyon. They traveled for days up this river. The going got harder. The snow got deeper. The dogs were struggling. Finally, after wasting nearly a week fighting their way up this canyon, the river just ended. It fizzled out into a dense forest of willow and jagged rocks. It was a dead end. They had taken the wrong turn. Fitzgerald stood there, looking at the dead end, and the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. They had wasted precious food and precious energy going the wrong way. He checked the supplies. They had enough food left for maybe a week or two, but they were only halfway to Dawson City. Fitzgerald made the only decision he could. He said, "We have to turn back. We have to go back to Fort McPherson." It was January 12th, 1911. The return trip should have been easy. Just follow their own tracks back, right? Wrong. The wind in the Arctic is relentless. Their tracks from the journey up the canyon had been completely blown away. They were breaking a fresh trail all over again. And now, the temperature dropped. We are talking about 50 degrees below zero. At that temperature, the air hurts to breathe. Your eyelashes freeze together, and they were running out of food. This is where the story shifts from an adventure to a horror movie. By mid-January, the dog food was gone. The dogs, which had been their loyal engines, were now starving. They became weak. And in the Arctic, when a sled dog can no longer pull, it becomes something else. It becomes food. Fitzgerald ordered the first dog to be killed. The men sat around the campfire, cooking the meat of the animal that had pulled them for hundreds of miles. It was a grim meal. Dog meat is tough, stringy, and has very little fat. In the cold, your body needs fat to burn for heat. Lean meat doesn't cut it. You can eat a full belly of lean meat and still starve to death. It is called rabbit starvation. As they trudged back toward Fort McPherson, the men began to deteriorate. Their faces grew gaunt. Their movements became slow and jerky. Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter were hit the hardest. They started to hallucinate. They complained of pains in their feet. Frostbite was setting in. Their toes were turning black. By the end of January, they were still hundreds of miles from safety. They were now killing a dog every few days just to stay alive. But there is a dark science to eating sled dogs. The liver of a dog, especially one that has been working hard in the Arctic, can be toxic to humans. It contains dangerous levels of vitamin A. But the men were so hungry, so desperate for anything that tasted like food, that they ate the livers too. This likely made them sick, causing their skin to peel and their heads to throb, adding to the misery. On February 5th, the group reached a breaking point. They were back at the river where they had made the wrong turn. But they were broken men. Taylor and Carter could barely walk. They were stumbling, falling, and crying out in pain. Fitzgerald looked at his team. He knew that if they stayed together, they would all die. Taylor and Carter were moving too slow. So, Fitzgerald made a desperate gamble. He decided to leave the two sick men behind with a small amount of equipment and camp. He and Constable Kinney, who was still somewhat mobile, would make a mad dash for Fort McPherson. They would run, get help, and send a rescue team back for the others. It was a noble plan, but it was a doomed plan. Fitzgerald and Kinney left their friends. They took the strongest remaining dogs and started running. But running is a strong word. They were shuffling. They were skeletons in parkas. A few days after they split up, Fitzgerald and Kinney realized they weren't going to make it. They were too weak. The snow was too deep. And then something truly heartbreaking happened. They realized that Taylor and Carter, the men they had left behind, had not stayed in camp. In a delirium of fear and madness, the two sick men had tried to follow them. Fitzgerald and Kinney stopped. They waited. Eventually, the two groups merged again. But now, nobody had any strength left. The dogs were all gone. They had eaten every single one. They were boiling the leather harnesses and the rawhide straps of their snowshoes to drink the broth, just to get the taste of something organic in their mouths. On February 12, 1911, the diary of Inspector Fitzgerald goes silent. Back at Fort McPherson, the weeks had ticked by. People were getting worried. The lost patrol should have been back, or a message should have arrived from Dawson City saying they made it. But the telegraph line was silent. A corporal named William Dempster, a man who respected Fitzgerald but knew the dangers of the land, decided to launch a rescue mission. He gathered a team of indigenous trackers and set out to find the lost legends. Dempster moved fast. He followed the trail. He found the abandoned campsites, and at each campsite, he found evidence of the horror. He found dog paws severed and left in the snow. He found harnesses cut up and chewed on. On March 21st, 1911, 3 months after the patrol had left, Corporal Dempster was traveling down the Peel River, just about 25 miles from Fort McPherson. 25 miles. That is one long day of hiking. They were so close. Dempster saw something in the distance. It was a blue handkerchief tied to a tree branch, fluttering in the wind. He approached it slowly. Beneath the tree, buried under a layer of fresh snow, were two shapes. Dempster brushed the snow away. It was Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter. They were lying side by side. They were emaciated beyond recognition. Their faces were skeletal. Carter's hands were folded over his chest. Taylor had evidently died first, and Carter, in his final moments, had tried to cover his friend with a sleeping bag before lying down to die himself. But where were Fitzgerald and Kinney? Dempster and his team continued searching. They found tracks leading away from the bodies. Fitzgerald and Kinney had tried one last, desperate push. They had left their dead friends to try and crawl the last 25 miles. About 10 miles further down the river, Dempster found a makeshift campsite. There was a kettle sitting on the remains of a fire that had burned out weeks ago. Inside the kettle was half-cooked piece of moose skin, part of their boots. And lying next to the fire were the bodies of Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and Constable George Kinney. Fitzgerald was lying on his back. Even in death, he looked like he was trying to maintain some dignity. But the scene was horrific. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Dempster searched Fitzgerald's pockets. He found a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper. On it, Fitzgerald had written his last will and testament. It was a message to his wife. The note was shaky, written by a hand that was freezing to death. It read, "All money, watch, map, and furs is left to my beloved wife, Leela, and daughter. God bless you." And then, underneath that, a final line that summed up the entire tragedy. A confession from the man who never failed, the man who thought he could beat the North. He wrote, "My last hope is gone." The discovery of the lost patrol shocked the world. It was front-page news in London, New York, and Ottawa. How could the best of the best die like this? An inquiry was held. They analyzed every decision Fitzgerald made. They concluded that it was a combination of bad luck, bad weather, and one fatal flaw: hubris. Fitzgerald wanted the speed record so badly that he refused a guide. He wanted to travel so light that he didn't bring enough food for an emergency. He trusted his own legend more than he trusted the reality of the landscape. When the bodies were examined, it was determined that they had died of starvation and exposure. But the psychological torture they endured, the realization that they had taken a wrong turn, the eating of the dogs, the slow march toward a home they would never see is unimaginable. They were buried in Fort McPherson. Their graves are still there today, 4 white picket fences in a row, marking the resting place of the lost patrol. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police changed their rules after this. They made it mandatory to hire indigenous guides for long patrols. They established food caches along the route so that no one would ever starve again. But the lesson of Inspector Fitzgerald remains. The Arctic is a place of absolute truth. It does not care about your rank. It does not care about your past victories. It does not care if you are a hero. If you take a wrong turn and you are not prepared, the wind will bury you just the same. So, the next time you are planning a trip and you think you don't need a map because you have a good sense of direction, just remember the lost patrol. Remember the blue handkerchief tied to a tree just 20 miles from safety. And remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that you need help. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are hitting the road for a classic piece of Americana, the vanishing hitchhiker legend. But this isn't the story your grandmother told you. This is a real-life, documented account from a lonely stretch of highway where the spectral and the physical world collided, leaving behind a terrifying mystery. This is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story centers on a specific, desolate stretch of highway known as Route 12, winding its way through the rugged, sparsely populated mountains of upstate New York. It's a road notorious for its hairpin turns, thick fog, and a long, tragic history of fatal accidents. The specific incident we're focusing on occurred in the dead of winter, in the year 1985. Our protagonist is a man named James Donovan. James was a traveling salesman for a regional paper company, a job that kept him on the road constantly. He was a skeptical, pragmatic man, utterly grounded in reality. He was driving his beat-up Ford sedan, heading back toward Albany after a long, unsuccessful day trying to close a deal in a remote town near the Canadian border. It was nearly 11 o'clock p.m. The temperature was well below freezing, and a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The radio was fading in and out, the static almost as loud as the distant whine of his engine. James was driving slowly, nervously peering through the misty beam of his headlights when he saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road, directly illuminated by his high beams, was a young woman. She was clearly in distress. She was wearing a thin, pale blue formal dress completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her dark hair was wet, plastered against her pale face, and she was standing stiffly, her thumb out, shivering violently. She looked like she had wandered out of a high school prom and into a nightmare. James, despite his exhaustion and his common sense telling him not to stop on a dark, foggy road, couldn't leave her there. He slowed down, pulled the sedan onto the snowy shoulder, and rolled down the passenger window. The moment he saw her face up close, he felt a wave of profound unease. Her eyes were wide, dark, and fixed on him with an expression of pure, bone-deep terror. "Where are you going?" James asked, trying to sound friendly. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "The bridge. I need to get to the old covered bridge, just up the road. Please, I have to get there now." Quote, James knew the bridge she meant. It was about 3 miles further down Route 12. It was an iconic, but very remote, landmark. "All right, hop in. You're freezing," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. The girl quickly opened the door and slid into the seat. The moment she settled beside him, James was hit by an intense wave of cold. It was far colder than the outside air, a chilling, damp cold that seemed to radiate directly from her body. He pulled back onto the highway. "My name is James. What's yours?" "Eliza," she replied, her voice still thin and strained. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead on the road, watching the fog-shrouded path ahead. James tried to make small talk, asking her what she was doing out here, who she was with, and why she was wearing a summer dress. Eliza's replies were short, fragmented, and strange. She mumbled something about a terrible argument and having to leave. She kept repeating that she was late and that she had to warn them. As they drove, James noticed something else disturbing. Despite the overwhelming cold she exuded, there was no sign of condensation, frost, or even a single shiver visible on her skin. She was perfectly, chillingly still. He glanced down at his dashboard. The thermometer gauge was inexplicably climbing, not dropping. The interior of the car was getting hotter, yet the cold radiating from Eliza was making James's side of the car feel like a freezer. They had been driving for about 5 minutes when the fog suddenly thickened, becoming an opaque, blinding wall of white. James had to slow the car down to barely 10 miles per hour. "Almost there," Eliza whispered, her voice tightening with dread. "It's coming." "What's coming, Eliza? The bridge?" "No," she said, her voice now dangerously calm. The sound. The sound of the car hitting the guardrail. James's blood ran cold. The way she said it was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact. A memory. He realized the horror of the situation. He wasn't giving a ride to someone in trouble. He was giving a ride to someone who had already been in trouble. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a shuddering halt in the middle of the empty highway. "Eliza, what are you talking about? Who are you?" he demanded, turning to face her. She finally looked at him. Her face was no longer pale. It was completely translucent, the color of milky glass. Her wide, dark eyes held an expression of infinite sorrow and regret. "I tried to tell them. I was supposed to be here," she said, her voice fading to a wispy echo. "But I ran. I never should have left the dance." Then, from the fog directly ahead of them, came a sound. It was the sickening, unmistakable sound of grinding metal, followed by the shattering noise of glass exploding and a low, terrible crunch. The sounds were deafening, visceral, and felt incredibly close. James instinctively covered his head, bracing for impact. But the sounds faded instantly, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the snowy road. The car hadn't moved. James realized the sounds hadn't come from a new accident. They were echoes, residual noise caught in the terrifying vortex that was Eliza. He looked back at the passenger seat. The seat was empty. Eliza was gone. There was no sound of a door opening or closing, no tracks in the snow outside the door. She had simply vanished. But she had left something behind. On the black vinyl of the passenger seat, there was a small puddle of water, not frozen, not melted, but perfectly room temperature, and lying in the center of the water was a piece of jewelry, a tiny, silver locket, slightly tarnished. James didn't hesitate. He jammed the gear shift into drive and sped away, not stopping until he reached the lights of the next town, nearly 30 miles away. He didn't report the incident to the police immediately. He knew how absurd his story sounded. Instead, the next day, using the information he gleaned from local historical records, he drove back to the small town near the Canadian border. He went to the local library and started digging through old newspaper archives from the 1960s. He found it on the third day. A yellowed clipping from the town paper, dated November 24th, 1962. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Prom Night. 3 high schoolers killed in Route 12 crash." The article detailed how 3 students, 2 boys and a girl, had died in a massive car crash after leaving a high school dance. They had hit a patch of ice, slid, and slammed into the guardrail near the covered bridge. The names of the victims were listed. One of the names was Eliza Thorne. The article also mentioned a significant detail. Eliza was the only one in the vehicle who survived the initial impact, but she had been thrown from the car and had died hours later from exposure and injuries on the shoulder of the road. She was found still clutching a silver locket. The police determined the crash was caused by excessive speed, but the students' families maintained that the car had veered to avoid something they never identified. James Donovan now understood. Eliza wasn't warning him of the crash, she was a restless spirit, reenacting her final moments, forever hitchhiking back to the crash site where she should have warned her friends and where she ultimately died alone. The sounds James heard were the auditory remnants of the tragedy, the final brutal noise of the car wreck that defined her death. James returned to the area near the old covered bridge. He found the exact stretch of road where he had stopped. He used a shovel to dig a small hole in the snow on the shoulder of the road, right where he had picked her up. He placed the silver locket into the hole, covered it with earth, and said a simple prayer for peace. He never saw Eliza again, but the story doesn't quite end there. 10 years later, in 1995, Route 12 was undergoing major construction. A team of road workers was widening the lane near the old covered bridge when they made an unexpected discovery. Buried just beneath the guardrail, they found the wreckage of an old Ford Fairlane from the 1960s. The car from the original tragedy, which had apparently been thrown over the embankment and buried by subsequent snow and repairs. And next to the car, they found the remains of two bodies. They were identified as the two male passengers from the accident. But only two bodies were accounted for. The police also found something else, a long, deep gouge in the pavement leading directly to the fatal spot. The gouge was much too clean and sharp to have been made by the initial impact. The road crew workers, when debriefed by the local sheriff, reported one strange detail. For the entire week they worked near that spot, they had battled an inexplicable, dense, localized fog that defied weather reports. And occasionally, late at night, when their work lights were on, they swore they could hear the faint, high-pitched scrape of something hard being dragged across the asphalt, desperately trying to get back to the crash site. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Until next time, take care of yourselves. How is everyone doing today? I hope you are all well, and if you are not, I hope things get better for you soon. Welcome back to the channel. I've got a true story for you today. It is strange, it is dark, and it is mysterious. And it details the horrifying events of a winter survival story that goes far beyond simple desperation, uncovering a terrible pact and a sequence of inexplicable phenomena that haunt one of the most infamous mountain passes in American history, Donner Summit. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Go down into the comment section and let me know. I always enjoy seeing how far the strange, dark, and mysterious family extends. Now, let's get into the story. Our narrative begins in the early 1940s, long after the tragic, well-documented events of the original Donner Party, but in the exact same unforgiving, brutal location in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This area, known today simply as Donner Pass, remains remote, beautiful, and lethally dangerous during the winter months. Our protagonists are two men, Elias Vance and Walter Wally Quinn. They were not pioneers or travelers, but dedicated maintenance engineers hired by the newly formed State Transit Authority. Their job was crucial, to man a tiny, isolated observation shack near the summit of the pass. They were the Watchmen. 1. The Den, the sod of the best on round 1. Their purpose was to continuously monitor the towering snowpack and radio in warnings of potential avalanches or road-closing drifts to the small, scattered communities below. The Watch Shack was essentially a concrete bunker, a small, windowless, heavily fortified structure anchored directly into the granite, equipped with a shortwave radio, minimal supplies, and enough food for 2 men for exactly 3 weeks. The plan was simple. They would hike in, stay for 3 weeks, and then a relief team would hike in to swap them out. Elias, the older of the two, was a calm, meticulous man, known for his skepticism. Wally, the younger, was energetic, prone to tall tales, and deeply uneasy about the history of the pass, often speaking of the ghosts of the hungry. They were deposited at the shack in early December. The first 2 weeks passed uneventfully, filled with boring maintenance checks and shortwave radio chatter. Then, disaster struck in the form of the blizzard of 41. A sudden, unprecedented storm rolled in from the Pacific. It wasn't just a heavy snowfall, it was a meteorological event of pure, focused fury. The snow fell constantly for 6 full days, driven by winds that sounded, as Elias recorded in his log, like 1,000 angry voices screaming in the rock. The snow piled up instantly, burying the shack completely under a suffocating, dense white blanket. The relief team, scheduled to arrive on the 21st day, never made it. The roads were closed, and the blizzard made any attempt at a rescue impossible. Elias and Wally were alone, trapped, and running out of time. They had enough rations for perhaps 4 days of minimal subsistence eating. And then, only the brutal silence of the snow. The third week saw the strange, dark, and mysterious begin. The silence after the storm was terrifying. They were in total darkness, relying solely on the tiny light of a kerosene lamp and the constant, static-filled drone of the shortwave radio. The first strange event was the radio silence. On the 22nd day, the shortwave, which had been their only link to the outside world, suddenly went dead. Not just static, the set produced a complete, utter silence, even though the batteries were fully charged, and Elias checked the antenna and found no damage. They were now truly alone. The next day, the real terror began. Elias and Wally were sitting in the near darkness, conserving their last rations, when they both heard it, a sound of something scraping against the concrete ceiling directly above them. It was not the sound of wind or ice. It was a precise, rhythmic, heavy scrape, 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 as if something with immense weight and sharp claws was slowly dragging itself across the solid 6-inch thick roof of the bunker. Elias, the rational man, grabbed an iron pry bar. He checked the pressure gauge, which showed the snowpack above them was over 15 feet thick. No known animal could survive, much less move, through that density of snow and ice. The scraping continued for an hour, growing louder and more deliberate, seeming to circle the tiny bunker. Wally, pale and shaking, whispered, "It's the hunger, Elias. The hunger has found us." On the 25th day, with the food completely gone and the gnawing pain of starvation setting in, Wally made a proposal, a chilling pact born of desperation. "Elias," Wally rasped, his voice weak, "we are going to die. But we can choose how. The past takes what it is owed. We have a radio log, a place name, a record of our existence. We leave one record behind, a final message. We agree. The first one to lose the fight leaves a note for the other." Elias, too weak to argue, reluctantly agreed to the grim, unspoken terms. The final survivor would detail the last actions, ensuring the outside world knew their struggle. It was a pact of final dignity against the inevitable. On the 28th day, Elias lost the ability to stand. He was lying on the cot, his mind slipping into feverish confusion. Wally was barely moving, curled up on the floor. It was then that the sphere returned to full operation. The shortwave radio, which had been silent for 6 days, suddenly blared to life. Elias scrambled to the set, expecting to hear the military or the rescue team. But the radio was not broadcasting human voices. It was broadcasting a single, continuous sound of chewing. It was a wet, sickening sound of flesh and bone being slowly, deliberately torn and crushed. The volume was immense, the sound filling the tiny shack, echoing every starved thought in their heads. The sound was accompanied by a single, high-pitched, metallic whine that made the teeth ache. The sound persisted for exactly 10 minutes, then abruptly cut off, returning the radio to the previous heavy silence. Wally, now sitting up, his eyes wide and black, looked at Elias. "It's telling us what to do," he whispered, his voice dangerously even. "The past demands it. It's showing us the future." On the 30th day, Wally was gone. Elias woke from a fitful, feverish sleep to find Wally's cot empty. His heart hammered in his chest. He dragged himself across the floor, searching the tiny bunker. Wally was not there. The single, heavily reinforced door, the only way in or out of the bunker, was still sealed shut by the internal locking mechanism that only Elias could reach. The bunker was a tomb, and Wally had vanished from inside a sealed coffin. Elias was alone, surrounded by the silence of the radio and the crushing darkness of the snowpack. He found Wally's final note tucked under his pillow, written in a shaky, almost incomprehensible hand. The note didn't talk about the pact or the radio. It read simply, "The watchman must report. The summit needs its voice." Elias spent the next 2 days in a state of delirious starvation, convinced he was hallucinating the empty bunker, the radio silence, and the terrifying sound of chewing. Then, the final, inexplicable event occurred. The shortwave radio blared to life again. This time, it was not the chewing sound. It was the sound of a human voice, Elias's own voice, but faint, distant, and distorted by static. Elias listened, terrified, as his own voice broadcast a series of precise, detailed weather and snowpack readings, followed by the clear, calm sign-off he used every day. "This is Watchman Vance reporting clear conditions. End transmission." The voice then faded back to silence. Elias was sitting there, weak, starving, and unable to speak. Yet the radio was broadcasting a complete current weather report in his voice, reporting clear conditions from inside a sealed, snowbound tomb. Elias realized the terrifying truth. Wally had not escaped, and the past did not demand a victim. It demanded a watchman. Wally's disappearance, the sound of the chewing, and the inexplicable broadcast of Elias's voice were all part of a dark, persistent phenomena that used the isolated watchman to keep the past clear. Elias never escaped the bunker. He was found weeks later, severely emaciated, still clutching the shortwave radio, his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of pure, final terror. He had died of starvation. Yet the final, horrifying analysis of his body showed that he had consumed something incredibly dense, non-nutritious, and fibrous, something the pathologists couldn't identify. And on the shortwave radio's log, the final entry, written in Elias's own hand on the day he died, was not a final goodbye, but a chilling message. "Conditions clear, visibility perfect, the summit is ready for travel." The most terrifying postscript to the story is that for the next 50 years, truckers, train engineers, and local residents who traveled the Donner Pass often reported hearing a faint, garbled voice cutting through their commercial radio bands, a voice giving outdated, nonsensical weather reports, and always signing off clearly, "This is Watchman Quinn reporting clear conditions." End transmission. The pass had taken its watchman, and in return for their ultimate sacrifice, it granted them eternal, starving servitude, binding their consciousness to the mountain itself to endlessly report the clear conditions that lure the next travelers into its ancient, hungry trap. And that is where our strange, dark, and mysterious story ends, with the chilling truth that sometimes the hunger of the mountain is not for flesh, but for silence. If you enjoyed this strange, dark, and mysterious story, please consider hitting that like button. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are exploring a chilling piece of urban folklore that migrated from the deep woods into a concrete city. This is a story about a very simple rule, a test of will, and the absolute terrifying consequence of breaking one single vital command. This is the story of Don't Look Up When You Hear the Whistle. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the vast, dense urban landscape of New York City, specifically within the sprawling, aged tunnels of the subway system in the late 1970s. This subterranean world is already a place of shadows, noise, and isolation, a perfect crucible for a strange, dark, and mysterious tale. Our protagonist is a young transit worker named Michael Rivera. Michael was in his early 20s, working as a signal maintainer, a dangerous, lonely job that required him to walk miles of dark track, checking and repairing communication lines and track switches, often in the dead of night. Michael was an educated man, highly skeptical of the ghost stories and urban legends that permeated the subterranean world of the transit workers. He dismissed talk of tunnel monsters and forgotten spirits as nonsense. However, one piece of folklore was repeated with such chilling seriousness by the veterans that even Michael paid attention. The rule of the midnight whistle. The old-timers warned every new recruit. If you are down in the tunnels alone between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and you hear a whistle, a clear, sharp, solitary note, you stop dead. You cover your head, and you do not, under any circumstances, look up. When Michael pressed the veterans for details, why? What happens? They would just shake their heads, their eyes holding a distant, genuine fear. It's not for seeing, kid. It's for hearing. If you look up, you become part of the sound. On a freezing Friday night in February, Michael was assigned to a deep stretch of track near a decommissioned subway loop, a massive, forgotten section known to be utterly silent and rarely used. At 2:30 a.m., Michael was deep in the tunnel, his helmet lamp cutting a lonely beam through the perpetual darkness. He was tightening a relay box, the metallic clink of his wrench, the only sound in the oppressive silence. He was focused on his work when it happened. He heard the whistle. It was not the sound of a train brake or a security guard's signal. It was a single, pure, high-pitched note, a sound so perfectly pitched and clear that it seemed to vibrate in the bone behind his ear. It sounded exactly like the sound made by blowing sharply across the top of an empty glass bottle, amplified tenfold. The sound was shockingly close, directly above him, resonating through the concrete arch of the tunnel roof. Michael froze instantly, dropping his wrench. The sound of the falling metal hitting the rail echoed for a long moment, but the whistle continued, holding that perfect, crystalline note. The old-timer's warnings flashed into his mind. "Don't look up!" He immediately bent down, tucking his head between his knees, covering his helmet with his gloved hands. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, listening to the impossible sound. The whistle did not stop. It held the note for what felt like an eternity, 30 seconds, then a full minute. The sound was so intense that it began to feel less like a whistle and more like a massive, sustained pressure, a physical force pushing down on the top of his skull. Then he heard something else, a sound of movement, faint but massive, scraping against the ceiling of the tunnel directly above him. It was a thick, wet shh, like a huge piece of canvas being dragged slowly across rough concrete. The sound was directly correlated with the whistle. The movement seemed to be generating the sound, or perhaps the sound was the movement. Michael's curiosity, the primal human need to understand, began to claw its way through his fear. What could make that sound? It was too big for a rat, too slow for a passing car, and too soft for a train. He felt an almost irresistible compulsion to raise his head, to turn his helmet lamp up, and to catch a glimpse of the thing moving across the ceiling. He fought it. He repeated the warning mantra in his mind. Don't look up. Don't look up. Finally, after what he calculated was almost 3 full minutes, the scraping sound and the whistle note abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was total and profound, broken only by Michael's frantic, shallow breathing. He waited another full minute, listening intently. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, Michael stood up. He left the wrench and his tools behind. He scrambled out of the tunnel and ran to the nearest emergency access ladder, climbing out and back into the cold, rational world of the surface. He didn't return to the tunnel that night. He called his supervisor, reporting a severe, localized electrical failure that necessitated immediate evacuation. He went home, shaken but alive. He was sure he had experienced a bizarre sensory illusion caused by stress and isolation, coupled with the old wives' tales. But the next day, the incident was far from over. Michael was back on the job, working in the main maintenance yard, trying to forget the whistle when his supervisor pulled him aside. "Rivera, we have a problem. We need you to go back to that abandoned loop you were working on last night." "What's the issue, sir?" Michael asked, his stomach tightening. "We sent a cleanup crew in after you reported the failure. They found your tools, but they also found something else. Something disturbing." Michael and the supervisor drove to the access point. 2 other men were waiting, their faces pale and uneasy. They descended into the tunnel. The air was sterile, cold, and strangely dry. Michael led them to the spot where he had been working. There were his tools, lying where they had fallen. And there, etched into the rough, dusty concrete ceiling directly above the spot where Michael had stood, was a pattern. It wasn't paint or graffiti or grease. It was a series of shallow, perfectly parallel gouges, 5 separate, straight lines, each about a foot long, dug deeply into the solid concrete. The lines looked like they had been scored by something immensely heavy and sharp. The 5 gouges were separated by a gap of approximately 3 feet, and then the pattern repeated. 5 more gouges. 5 lines, pause, 5 lines. It was the whistle's rhythm, translated into physical damage. The creature above the tunnel had been tracing the pattern of the sound it was making into the concrete directly above Michael's head. The shirk Michael had heard was the sound of the unknown thing using five sharp, immense appendages to score the ceiling, followed by a pause and then five more scores. The supervisor shone his high-powered lamp directly onto the pattern. "What the hell is this, Rivera? What were you doing down here?" Michael just stared up at the impossible damage. His refusal to look up had saved his life. Or perhaps saved his sanity. But the most terrifying discovery was made just a few feet away. The supervisor's lamp moved to the tunnel wall, and there, written in a thick, wet-looking reddish-brown fluid, was a single, crudely drawn symbol. It was a circle with a single, massive eye drawn in the center, staring directly down the tunnel toward the maintenance yard. Below the eye, scrawled into the concrete with the same thick fluid, were four words. They were written in perfect, clear English, and they were addressed directly to Michael. The message read, "We heard you breathing." The implication was terrifying. The entity knew he was there. It wasn't an accidental encounter. The whistle was a direct acknowledgement, and the rule, "Don't look up," was the only defense. The creature was waiting for a sound to identify and classify him. Michael immediately quit his job. He never set foot in the subway system again. He eventually moved out of New York, unable to bear the thought of the vast, silent world beneath the city that occasionally sends up its terrifying coded sounds. He often thinks of the thing that was directly above his head, the thing with five limbs, the intelligence that knows the frequency of a perfect note, and the patience to wait for 3 minutes until he made a sound. And sometimes, late at night, in the complete quiet of his new home, he thinks he can hear a faint, high-pitched ringing in his ears, a residual frequency left behind. And he instinctively ducks his head and covers his ears, praying that the sound remains internal and that he never, ever breaks the rule and looks up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of why you shouldn't look up when you hear the whistle. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are venturing into the primal fear of the forest, the vast, ancient woods where the laws of man yield to something far older and less forgiving. This is the story of a woman who didn't just live near the forest, but who knew its secrets too well and paid an ultimate, chilling price for her knowledge. This is the story of She Knew Too Much About the Woods. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story takes us to the dense, sprawling forests of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, around the year 1967. The specific area is known locally as the Whisperwind Ridge, a region famous for its impenetrable thickets, sudden, disorienting fogs, and a disproportionately high number of unexplained disappearances. Our protagonist is an elderly woman named Agnes Morrow. Agnes was in her late 70s, a fiercely independent recluse who lived in a small, weathered cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest paved road. The locals regarded Agnes with a mixture of fear and reverence. She was an herbalist, a midwife, and a keeper of old, strange knowledge. Agnes didn't just live near the woods, she was an integral part of them. She knew every trail, every spring, and every rock face. More importantly, she knew the rules of the woods, rules that had nothing to do with hiking etiquette or foraging seasons. The local sheriff's department often relied on Agnes for search and rescue operations, as she was the only person who could consistently track lost hikers and return them safely. But Agnes was very selective. She would only go into the woods for a lost person under specific conditions, and only if she felt the forest would allow her to return them. On one famous occasion, she refused to look for a missing hunter, stating simply, "He broke the old rule. The woods took their payment. I won't cross the line for him." The hunter's remains were never found. The main person in our story who knew Agnes best was Deputy Earl Jenkins. Earl was a young, skeptical officer who, despite his scientific training, couldn't deny Agnes's unsettling accuracy. In the summer of 1967, a major search effort was launched for a missing family of 4, the Millers, who had vanished while hiking a supposedly well-marked trail near Whisperwind Ridge. After 5 days of fruitless searching, with the weather turning cold and foggy, Sheriff's Command reluctantly called Agnes. Earl drove the old woman to the trailhead. Agnes, dressed in heavy wool and carrying a simple staff, stood silently at the entrance to the forest. She didn't look at the ground. She looked up at the canopy as if asking permission. After a few minutes, she spoke, her voice dry as dead leaves. The woods are willing to give the father back, but only the father. The others. They crossed the boundary when the fog rolled in. They are under the quiet. Earl, though horrified by her cold certainty, begged her to lead the search for the father. Agnes spent the next 6 hours in the woods, leading a team of 5 deputies, including Earl, on a path that defied all logic. It was not a trail, but a series of precise, impossible zigzags between boulders and thickets. Just as the sun began to set, they found the father, Mr. Miller. He was alive, but completely catatonic, curled up beneath a shallow rock overhang, shivering uncontrollably. He was physically unharmed, but his eyes were vacant, fixed on something none of them could see. Agnes immediately checked his pockets. She pulled out a small metallic object, a child's toy whistle, painted bright red. He held the wrong thing, Agnes whispered to Earl, throwing the whistle into a deep bed of moss. He tried to keep a piece of the outside world when he was on the inside. That's why they let him go. She led the man out, refusing to go back for the mother and children. The search was called off. The remaining 3 members of the Miller family were never seen again, vanishing into the quiet depths of the Appalachian forest. The chilling success of that rescue cemented Agnes's disturbing reputation, but it also marked the beginning of her own demise. After the Miller rescue, Earl Jenkins began visiting Agnes at her cabin. Not for cases, but out of desperate curiosity. He wanted to know the rules. He wanted to understand the quiet and the payment she spoke of. Agnes, surprisingly, began to talk. She explained that the woods weren't just trees and animals, they were an entity, a self-contained system with a profound, almost territorial intelligence. She told him, "Add it, the rule of noise. Never make unnecessary noise after sundown. The woods tolerate the wind and the stream, but they do not tolerate loud human sound. It wakes what sleeps below. The rule of memory. Do not carry a piece of the woods away with you. If you take a stone or a piece of deadfall, the woods will remember your scent and call you back when you sleep. The rule of direction. The trails are not for walking on. The trails are the teeth of the forest. They only lead you to the edges. Go off the trail, and the woods will choose your direction for you." Agnes told Earl she had learned these rules from her own grandmother, who had lived the same life, and that the ultimate penalty for breaking the rules was the quiet. The quiet, she explained, is when the forest decides you don't belong here, and it removes your memory from the world. It silences your name. Your friends forget you. Your belongings disappear. You become a piece of the quiet, indistinguishable from the moss and the stone. One late autumn afternoon, Earl drove out to visit Agnes. He found her sitting on her porch, staring intently at the deep green boundary of the forest. She looked worried, older than her years, and spoke without preamble. "I broke the rule, Earl. I shouldn't have brought the father out. I crossed the line. The quiet is coming for me." Earl tried to reassure her, suggesting she was just tired. "No," she insisted, shaking her head slowly. "Last night, I woke up and my wedding ring was gone. It was on my hand when I went to sleep. I didn't take it off. I never take it off." "Maybe you lost it in the house, Agnes." "No. And this morning I spoke to the mail carrier. He was a kind boy. He asked who I was. He said he'd never seen me before. He comes here every Tuesday." The quiet was not just about the forest taking her, it was about the world forgetting she had ever existed. Earl stayed with her for 3 hours, trying to talk sense into her, trying to convince her to come back to town. She refused. As he drove away, he looked back at the small cabin. Agnes was still sitting on the porch, a tiny, defiant figure against the massive, looming backdrop of the Whisperwind Ridge. Earl returned the next morning, driving straight to the secluded clearing where her cabin stood. The cabin was gone. Not destroyed, not burned down, just gone. The clearing was empty. There was no foundation, no remnants of burned wood, no disturbed earth. The clearing was simply a natural, grass-covered space ringed by the tall, indifferent trees. Earl searched frantically, circling the spot, looking for any sign that a structure had ever stood there. He eventually found a small, circular depression in the ground, covered in fresh, wet moss. It was exactly the size and shape of an old water well, but it was capped with a flat, impossibly smooth piece of granite. He stood in the empty clearing, the utter silence of the woods pressing down on him. He realized that the forest hadn't merely destroyed Agnes's cabin, it had erased it, removing the physical structure and the memory of its presence. He spent the next week investigating. He checked land records. The lot Agnes claimed to own was unmarked, listed as unclaimed forest land. He checked the sheriff's records for Agnes Morrow. She was not in the database. He checked his own files. The reports detailing the rescue of the Miller family mentioned only the father, Mr. Miller, being found, led out by Deputy Jenkins and two other deputies. There was no mention of an elderly female tracker. He asked the other deputies who had been on the Miller rescue team. They remembered the father, the fog, the trauma. But when asked who led them back, one deputy frowned and said, "It was you, Earl. You seem to know the way, stepping off the trail like that." Earl Jenkins was the only person left who remembered Agnes Morrow. He had been so close to the quiet, he had nearly been consumed by it himself. He left the sheriff's department shortly after, unable to live with the knowledge he possessed. He kept only one small thing: a single, black and white photograph he had secretly taken of Agnes on her porch the last day he saw her. He kept the photo hidden away in a safe deposit box. But over the years, he noticed a horrifying change. The photograph wasn't fading. It was becoming more indistinct. Agnes's face was blurring, her features softening into an indistinguishable shadow. And the background, the deep green forest, was becoming sharper, clearer, and more dominant. The quiet was still working, slowly erasing her image from the physical world, piece by piece. Earl Jenkins knew that one day he would open the box and the photograph would be completely blank. And on that day, the forest would have won the final, chilling victory. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the woman who knew too much about the woods. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Today's story is about a night of celebration that turned into a scene of absolute, incomprehensible horror. It happened on a night when the whole world was looking forward to a fresh start, only to find that for some, the clock would stop exactly at midnight. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. The city of Seattle, Washington, is known for many things: the Space Needle, the rain, and a very vibrant underground art scene. By the time December 31st, 2023 rolled around, everyone in the city was looking for the IT Party. And that year, the IT Party was being held at a place called the Iron Foundry. The Iron Foundry was a massive converted industrial warehouse located right on the edge of the Elliott Bay waterfront. It had been built back in 1924, and for decades it was used to forge heavy machinery for the shipping industry. But by 2023, it had been hollowed out and turned into a premier event space. It had these towering 40-foot ceilings, exposed brick walls, and massive steel rafters that still had the original rust-colored chains hanging from them. It was the perfect industrial chic vibe. Enter a man named Elias. Elias was a 27-year-old freelance photographer who had spent the last 3 years trying to make a name for himself. He was talented, but in a city like Seattle, the competition was fierce. When he landed a gig to be the lead photographer for the Iron Foundry's Century Gala, a massive New Year's Eve bash celebrating the building's 100th year, he knew this was his big break. On the evening of December 31st, 2023, Elias arrived at the foundry around 8 o'clock in the evening. The air outside was biting cold, somewhere around 32 degrees, and the wind coming off the water felt like 1,000 tiny needles hitting your face. But inside, the foundry was glowing. They had strung up over 5,000 individual fairy lights across the rafters, and there was a massive crystal chandelier hanging right in the center of the dance floor. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the guests started pouring in. We're talking about 600 people, all dressed in tuxedos and floor-length gowns. There was an open bar, a live jazz band, and the atmosphere was electric. Elias was everywhere, snapping photos of local celebrities, tech moguls, and socialites. He noticed that the floor, which was made of heavy, polished timber planks, felt incredibly solid under his feet. It had to be. It was designed to hold the weight of literal tons of iron back in the 1920s. However, as the night went on, Elias started to notice something a bit off. Around 10:30 in the evening, he was standing near the back of the room by the service entrance, changing the battery in his camera. As he leaned against one of the massive brick pillars, he felt a vibration. Now, in a party with 600 people dancing, you expect the floor to shake a little. But this wasn't a rhythmic vibration from the music. It was a low, grinding shudder that seemed to come from deep beneath the building. It lasted for about 4 seconds and then stopped. Elias looked around, but nobody else seemed to notice. The music was too loud, the laughter too high. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a large ship docking at the pier next door. But then, at 11:15 in the evening, it happened again. This time, it was louder. A sharp crack echoed through the room, sounding like a gunshot. A few people on the dance floor stopped and looked around, confused. The band stumbled for a second, but the lead singer made a joke about the building reaching its 100th birthday, and everyone laughed and went back to their drinks. Elias, though, wasn't laughing. Being a photographer, he had a very keen eye for detail. He walked over to the spot where he thought the sound had come from a section of the floor near the VIP lounge. He knelt down, pretending to adjust his camera bag, and looked at the timber planks. There was a gap. A gap about 2 inches wide had opened up between two of the massive beams, and when he leaned in closer, he didn't see the concrete subfloor he expected to see. He saw nothing, just a pitch-black void. And from that void, he could smell the salt of the ocean and the rank odor of rotting wood. He realized in that moment that this part of the foundry wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on an old pier system, wooden pilings driven into the mud of the bay a century ago. Elias found the event coordinator, a woman named Sarah, who was frantically checking her watch. He pulled her aside and said, "Sarah, I think there's something wrong with the floor. There's a structural gap opening up near the VIP section." Sarah looked at him like he had two heads. "Elias," she said, "it's 11:45 in the evening. We have 15 minutes until the biggest countdown in the city. The building has been here for 100 years. It's fine. Just keep taking pictures." Elias tried to protest, but Sarah had already disappeared into the crowd. Elias stood there, heart racing. He looked at the 600 people in the room. They were all moving toward the center of the floor for the big countdown. 600 people, all concentrated in one single area. If you do the math, and assume the average person weighs 160 pounds, that is 96,000 pounds of human weight concentrated on a floor that was currently groaning. At 11:55 in the evening, the energy hit a fever pitch. The band stopped playing, and a giant digital clock projected onto the brick wall began the final 5-minute count. Elias felt a sense of impending doom. He didn't want to be that guy who ruined New Year's, but his gut was screaming at him. He moved toward the exit, pushing through the crowd. He got to the heavy steel doors and stepped out onto the loading dock into the freezing night air. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. He told himself he was being paranoid. Inside, he could hear the crowd starting the final count. 10. Elias looked through the glass window of the door. He saw the sea of happy faces, their glasses raised. 9. He saw Sarah, the coordinator, smiling and holding a bottle of champagne. 8. The grinding sound returned, but this time it didn't stop. It was a continuous, deafening roar of wood splintering. 7. Elias saw the massive crystal chandelier in the center of the room begin to sway. Not just a little bit, but a violent, swinging motion. 6. The projector on the wall flickered. The brickwork began to shower dust down onto the guests. 5. Suddenly, the music cut out. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, except for the glowing red numbers of the countdown clock. 4. In the dim red light, Elias saw the center of the dance floor simply vanish. There was no slow creak. It was an instantaneous, catastrophic failure. The timber planks snapped like toothpicks. 1 second, there were hundreds of people jumping and cheering, and the next, there was only a gaping hole. 3. The screams started. But they weren't the screams of a party. They were the sounds of pure, unadulterated terror. Because the foundry was built over the water, those people weren't falling onto a basement floor. They were falling 20 feet down into the freezing, black, 45-degree waters of Elliott Bay, trapped under the weight of the very timber and steel that was supposed to protect them. Two, Elias watched in horror as the rest of the floor began to unzip. The structural failure was cascading. The massive steel pillars that held up the roof were losing their footing. One of the pillars shifted, and the roof above the dance floor began to cave in. 1. The countdown clock hit 0. The Happy New Year banner, which was rigged to drop from the ceiling, fell into the abyss. But there was no cheering. There was only the sound of rushing water and the groans of dying machinery. Elias didn't wait. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered almost immediately. 911. What is your emergency? Elias was hyperventilating. The Iron Foundry, Pier 54. The floor collapsed. Hundreds of people are in the water. You need everybody. Police, fire, Coast Guard, now. As he stood on that loading dock, Elias could hear the people below. The water in the bay was so cold that cold shock response would set in within seconds. When you hit water that cold, your body's natural instinct is to gasp. If your head is underwater when you gasp, you drown instantly. If you stay afloat, you have maybe 10 minutes before your limbs stop working. Within 5 minutes, the first sirens could be heard. Seattle Fire Department arrived with 4 engines and 2 ladder trucks, but when they looked inside the building, they realized the situation was even worse than reported. The collapse had severed the main gas line. One of the firefighters, a veteran named Miller who had been on the force for 22 years, later said it was the most haunting thing he'd ever seen. He stood at the edge of the jagged floor, shining a high-powered flashlight down into the hole. He could see dozens of people clinging to floating pieces of timber. He saw the sequins of evening gowns shimmering in the dark water. But then, he smelled the gas. "Everyone out!" Miller shouted. "No sparks! No lights! Get out now!" But it was too late. Somewhere in the wreckage, a severed electrical wire sparked. The explosion didn't level the building, but it sent a fireball through the upper rafters, causing the remaining part of the roof, the part that hadn't collapsed, to come crashing down. This created a pancake effect. The heavy roof debris fell onto the floor, which then fell onto the people already struggling in the water below. By 2 o'clock in the morning on January 1st, 2024, the scene was a nightmare. The Coast Guard had sent 3 boats to circle the pier, pulling anyone they could find out of the water. Divers were sent down into the dark, debris-filled bay, but the visibility was 0. They had to feel their way through a forest of jagged wood and twisted metal. Elias stayed there the whole night. He sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket. He watched as they brought the survivors out. Some were blue from the cold, shivering so hard they couldn't speak. Others were silent, staring off into nothing. Then, they started bringing out the black bags. The final tally was staggering. Out of the 600 people at the gala, 112 did not make it through the night. 48 had drowned in the initial collapse, and the rest were lost to the explosion or the hypothermia that followed. But here is where the story gets truly strange. When the investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board and structural engineers began their sweep of the wreckage on January 2nd, 2024, they found something that made no sense. They were looking at the main support pilings, the giant wooden poles that go from the building down into the seabed. These pilings are usually treated with creosote to prevent rot and are inspected every 5 years. According to the city records, the Iron Foundry had passed its inspection in 2021. However, when they pulled one of the central pilings out of the mud, they saw that it hadn't just rotted. It looked like it had been eaten, but not by a natural organism. There were perfectly circular holes, exactly 3 inches in diameter, bored straight through the center of the 12-inch thick oak pilings. The engineers counted over 200 of these holes across the entire support system. It looked like the building had been standing on Swiss cheese. When they analyzed the interior of the holes, they found traces of a high alkaline chemical compound that shouldn't exist in the Puget Sound. It was a substance that practically dissolved organic matter on contact. The investigation went on for months. They looked into the owners of the building, the inspection company, and even local shipping companies to see if there had been a chemical spill, but they found nothing. No records of that chemical being sold or transported in the state of Washington. Then, an anonymous whistleblower from the city's archives department sent a package to the local news. Inside was a set of blueprints for the iron foundry dating back to 1924. On the original blueprints, there was a handwritten note in the margins of the foundation page. It said, "Do not build over the salt well. The ground here does not belong to the city." The salt well was a local legend from the 1800s. The indigenous tribes of the area had warned the early settlers that there was a specific spot on the waterfront where the water ate the wood. They believed it was a vent to something much deeper, something that didn't like being covered up. The developers in 1924 had ignored the warning. They built the foundry anyway, and for 99 years, it held. But on that 100th year, during the loudest, heaviest moment in the building's history, whatever was down there finally finished what it started. Elias eventually moved away from Seattle. He stopped taking photos of parties. In fact, he stopped taking photos of people altogether. He moved to the desert in Arizona, as far away from the ocean as he could get. He still has his camera from that night. He never cleared the memory card. On that card, there is one final photo he took at exactly 11:59 and 59 seconds. It was a long exposure shot aimed at the dance floor right as the lights flickered. In the photo, because of the blur, you can see the people falling. But if you look at the very bottom of the frame, in the dark void where the floor used to be, you can see something else. It's not a piling, and it's not a piece of debris. It looks like a series of hundreds of pale, thin, elongated arms reaching up out of the black water, catching the guests before they even hit the surface. And that is why Elias doesn't go near the water anymore, because he knows that while the world was shouting Happy New Year, something else was finally getting its invitation to the party. Today's story is about a manhunt that sounds like it was written for a Hollywood action movie, but it is 100% true. It involves a man who possessed superhuman endurance, a man who could vanish into thin air, and a man who triggered the first ever aerial police chase in history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand how impossible this story is, you first have to understand the environment. We are going to the far northern edge of Canada, to the Yukon and Northwest Territories border. The year is 1931. This is a place where the sun barely rises in the winter. The temperature routinely drops to 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees below zero. It is a land of silence, snow, and death. If you make a mistake here, you do not just get hurt. You freeze solid. In July of 1931, a stranger arrived in the small settlement of Fort McPherson. He was a man of few words. In fact, he barely spoke at all. He was about 35 years old, with piercing blue eyes and a strong, stocky build. He told people his name was Albert Johnson. Now, in the North, people tend to be private. They do not ask too many questions. But Albert Johnson was different. He was not just private. He was hostile. He bought supplies, flour, sugar, a rifle, and ammunition, and then he floated down the Peel River on a makeshift raft. He eventually found a spot on the banks of the Rat River to build a cabin. But this was not a normal cabin. Most trappers build a simple shack to keep the wind out. Albert Johnson built a fortress. He cut down trees and built a small, squat cabin, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. He sank the logs deep into the frozen ground. He cut shooting ports, small holes in the walls, so he could fire a gun in any direction without being seen. He built the door to be reinforced. It was as if he was preparing for a war. For the first few months, Johnson kept to himself. But in December of 1931, the local indigenous trappers began to notice something strange. Their traps were being triggered. Someone was springing them and hanging them in the trees. This is a huge violation of the unwritten code of the bush. You do not mess with another man's livelihood. The trappers complained to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, or the Mounties. On December 26th, 1931, a police officer named Constable Alfred King and a special constable named Joe Bernard decided to pay Albert Johnson a visit. It was a routine check. They just wanted to tell him to knock it off. They trekked 60 miles through the snow to get to Johnson's cabin. When they arrived, they saw smoke curling from the chimney. Johnson was inside. Constable King walked up to the door and knocked. "Mr. Johnson," he called out. "I am Constable King with the RCMP. I need to speak with you." Silence. King knocked again. "Mr. Johnson, open the door!" Inside the cabin, Johnson remained dead silent. But King could hear him moving. He could feel eyes watching him through one of those shooting ports. King looked at Bernard. This was weird. Usually, a lonely trapper is happy to see a friendly face. But Johnson gave them nothing. Without a warrant, the officers could not break in. So, frustrated, they turned around and made the 60-mile trek back to Fort McPherson to get a search warrant. 5 days later, King returned. This time, he brought 3 other officers with him. They had a warrant. They meant business. They approached the cabin. It was dead silent. The snow was piled high around the walls. Constable King walked up to the heavy wooden door. He shouted, "Johnson! Open up! We have a search warrant!" There was no answer. King stepped forward and put his hand on the door to push it open. Boom! A shot rang out from inside the cabin. The bullet punched through the wooden door and slammed into Constable King's chest. King was thrown backward into the snow, blood pouring from his wound. The other officers scrambled for cover behind the trees. They opened fire on the cabin, peppering the logs with bullets. But Johnson had built his fortress well. The bullets just thudded harmlessly into the thick timber. The officers were in a panic. Their friend was bleeding out in the snow, and they were pinned down by a maniac in a bunker. They managed to crawl out, grab King, and drag him to safety. They loaded King onto a dog sled and raced him back to civilization. It was a miracle, but King survived. Now, the gloves were off. You do not shoot a Mountie and get away with it. A posse was formed. It was led by Inspector Eames. He gathered 9 men, 42 dogs, and 20 pounds of dynamite. They were going to blast Albert Johnson out of his hole. On January 9th, 1932, the posse arrived at the cabin. It was 40 degrees below zero. A blizzard was raging. They surrounded the cabin. Inspector Eames shouted for Johnson to surrender. The only answer was a gunshot. The siege began. The police fired hundreds of rounds into the cabin. Johnson returned fire with deadly accuracy. He moved from one shooting port to another, keeping the 9 men at bay. Finally, Inspector Eames had enough. He ordered the dynamite to be brought forward. One of the officers crawled through the snow, lit a fuse on a 4-pound bundle of dynamite, and tossed it onto the roof of the cabin. The explosion was massive. It shattered the silence of the Arctic night. The roof of the cabin collapsed. One of the walls blew out. The cabin was reduced to a smoking pile of rubble. The officers stood up. They lowered their guns. There was no way anyone could have survived that. It was over. They began to walk toward the ruins to recover the body. Suddenly, from the smoking debris, a figure rose up. It was Albert Johnson. He had dug a foxhole inside the floor of his cabin and had hunkered down during the explosion. He popped up like a jack-in-the-box and opened fire. The officers dove into the snow. They could not believe it. This man was unkillable. The weather was getting worse. The officers were freezing. They were running low on food for the dogs. They realized they could not take him that night. So, incredibly, the posse retreated. They left Albert Johnson alone in the ruins of his fortress. When they returned a few days later, Johnson was gone. Thus began the most famous manhunt in Canadian history. Albert Johnson was on the run. But he was not running like a normal man. He was running like a machine. The conditions were horrific. It was now roughly 50 degrees below zero. Most men would die of exposure within hours without a fire and a tent. Johnson had no tent. He had no sleeping bag. He had very little food. And he was being chased by expert trackers and indigenous guides who knew the land better than anyone. But Johnson was always one step ahead. He used tricks that baffled the trackers. He would walk backward in his snowshoes for miles to make it look like he was going the other way. He would walk in the tracks of caribou herds to hide his footprints. At night, he did not build a fire because the smoke would give him away. So, how did he survive? How did he not freeze to death? He dug down into the snowbanks to create tiny insulated caves to sleep in. He ate whatever he could find. Some reports say he chewed on tree bark and raw small game he managed to snare on the run. This is where the legend of his toughness grew. He was consuming the land itself to keep going. The posse chased him for weeks. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he vanished. At one point, Johnson reached a barrier that the police thought would stop him. It was the Richardson Mountains. These are steep, jagged peaks that form a wall between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. In the dead of winter, they are considered impassable. The police blocked the only two passes through the mountains. They sat there, waiting, thinking, "We have him trapped. He has to come through here." But Johnson did not use the passes. In the middle of a blizzard, in pitch-black darkness, Albert Johnson did the impossible. He climbed a 7,000-foot vertical cliff face of ice and rock. He did this without climbing gear, wearing heavy winter clothes, carrying a rifle and a backpack. When the trackers found his tracks at the top of the mountain a few days later, they were stunned. The indigenous guides looked at the cliff and said it was impossible. But the tracks were there. Johnson was superhuman, but the law was catching up. On January 30th, the posse caught up to him in a thick patch of forest. They spotted him. "Surrender, Johnson!" Johnson responded with his rifle. In the chaotic gunfight that followed, a brave young officer named Constable Edgar Millen was shot through the heart. He died instantly. Now, Johnson was a cop killer twice over, or at least he had killed one and wounded another. The Mounties were furious. They were not going to let this man escape. They realized that on foot, they could not match him. Johnson was moving too fast. He was averaging nearly 30 miles a day in deep snow. So they called in a secret weapon. For the first time in the history of police work, they hired an airplane to help in a manhunt. They called in a legendary bush pilot named Wilfred Wap May. Wap May arrived in his Belanca monoplane. He flew over the frozen wilderness looking for tracks. From the air, Johnson could not hide his trail as easily. Wap May could spot the line of footprints leading through the snow and radio the position to the ground team. Johnson heard the plane. He tried to use the tactic of backtracking, walking in circles, confusing the trail. But the plane was relentless. On February 17th, 1932, the end finally came. The plane spotted Johnson walking down the middle of the frozen Eagle River. The high banks of the river made it hard for him to climb out quickly. The ground team, following the pilot's signals, came around the bend of the river. There he was, the mad trapper. He was about 300 yards away. He saw the police sleds coming. He saw the plane circling overhead. He knew there was nowhere left to run. Albert Johnson didn't try to talk. He didn't try to surrender. He just dropped to his knees, dug a shallow trench in the snow, and raised his rifle. The police officers fanned out. They yelled for him to give up. Johnson fired. The shootout on the Eagle River was intense. Bullets were flying everywhere, kicking up sprays of ice and snow. Wap May, the pilot, was circling above, watching the whole thing. He later said it looked like a war scene. Johnson was hit, but he kept firing. He was hit again. He kept firing. Finally, a bullet severed his spine. The firing stopped. The officers waited. The wind howled over the ice. Slowly, carefully, they approached the body. Albert Johnson lay face down in the snow. He was dead. His body was a wreck. He was emaciated. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His face was sunken, his skin waxy from frostbite and starvation. He had practically eaten nothing for a month. Yet he had outrun a team of well-fed men and dogs for 150 miles. But the mystery of the mad trapper did not end with his death. In fact, it only got deeper. When they searched his body, they found a few $1,000s in cash, a huge amount for 1932. They found some gold teeth in his pocket, which was strange. They found a compass, a knife, and some pills. But they did not find a single piece of identification. No wallet, no letters, no name. Albert Johnson was just a name he had given when he arrived. It was an alias. They took his fingerprints. They sent them to the FBI in America, to Scotland Yard in England, to police forces all over Canada. No match. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew why he had come to the Arctic. Nobody knew why he hated the police so much that he was willing to die rather than just talk to them about some beaver traps. For decades, theories ran wild. Was he a bank robber from Chicago hiding out? Was he a draft dodger from World War I? Was he a mentally unstable hermit? They exhumed his body, dug it up several times over the years to do DNA testing. Finally, in 2021, nearly 90 years after the shootout, a team of genetic investigators made a breakthrough. Using advanced DNA genealogy, they linked the Mad Trapper to a family in Sweden. His real name, they believe, was Patrick Ginter. But even with a name, we still do not have the why. We do not know what snapped in his mind. We do not know what darkness he was running from that made the frozen hell of the Canadian Arctic seem like a safe haven. What we do know is that for 48 days, one man waged a war against nature and the law. He survived explosions, starvation, and the bitter cold, fueled by a rage that kept him warm when the fire could not. He was the man who ate trees. He was the man who refused to break. And in the end, it took an army, an airplane, and a bullet to stop the ghost of the Rat River. So, if you are ever in the Yukon and you hear the wind howling through the canyons, just remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the cold or the bears. It's a man who has nothing left to lose. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are diving into a cold case that has baffled law enforcement for decades. A perfect, clean disappearance where the evidence contradicts itself, leaving behind a profound and unnerving mystery. This is a story about how a person can vanish completely, leaving behind only their perfectly preserved and utterly normal life. This is the story of They Found the Car, but Never the Driver. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the vast, desolate landscape of the American Great Basin, specifically in the state of Nevada in the summer of 1994. This is a region of long, empty highways and expansive desert where the nearest sign of civilization might be 50 miles away. Our central figure is a man named Peter Graham. Peter was a 35-year-old software engineer from Sacramento, California. He was a creature of habit, known for his punctuality and meticulous organization. In July of 1994, Peter took a week off work, telling his family he was driving to Salt Lake City, Utah for a solo hiking trip in the mountains. He left his home on a Friday morning, driving his brand new metallic blue Ford Explorer. He was expected to call his wife, Carol, that Sunday evening upon checking into his hotel in Salt Lake City. Sunday came and went. Carol did not receive a call. Monday morning, Peter did not check in to his office. By Tuesday, Carol filed a missing person report. Peter Graham had vanished without a trace between Sacramento and Salt Lake City. The police immediately launched an investigation, focusing on the most logical assumption: a car accident on one of the treacherous mountain passes of the Sierra Nevada. For 3 agonizing weeks, the search turned up nothing. Peter's blue Ford Explorer, which should have been highly visible, was nowhere to be found. The police began to suspect foul play, a robbery, or perhaps Peter had abandoned his life, though those close to him dismissed this idea immediately. Then, nearly a month after Peter disappeared, a state trooper patrolling a remote, unpaved service road 50 miles north of Tonopah, Nevada, a road Peter had absolutely no logical reason to be on, spotted something out of place. It was the blue Ford Explorer. The car was parked deep off the main road, resting perfectly level on a stretch of flat, packed earth. It was not hidden. It was simply placed, facing west, toward the setting sun. The police swarmed the location. The first thing they noted was the sheer anomaly of the scene. The car was pristine. There was no crash damage, no dents, and no mud. It was simply parked, as if waiting for its owner to return from a brief errand. The official report, written by the lead detective, described the interior of the Explorer in minute, chilling detail. The interior of the Ford Explorer. The keys. The ignition was off, and the keys were not in the car. They were found resting neatly on the center console, exactly where one might place them before getting out. The personal effects. Peter's wallet, containing $400 in cash and all his identification, was on the passenger seat. His expensive wristwatch was on the dashboard. His laptop, still inside its carrying case, was on the back seat. Nothing of value had been stolen. The windows and doors. All four windows were rolled up tightly. The doors were unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle, forced entry, or resistance. The food. A half-eaten sandwich, wrapped in aluminum foil, was resting on the driver's side floor mat beside a nearly full can of soda. The food was slightly spoiled by the desert heat, suggesting it had been left within the first few days of the disappearance. The gas tank. The fuel gauge read nearly full. Peter had only driven a fraction of the distance from his last known gas stop. The car was a perfect snapshot of an ordinary moment suddenly interrupted. Peter Graham had stopped his car, turned off the engine, placed his keys and belongings neatly inside, taken a bite of his lunch, and then stepped out. And then he had vanished. The search teams, dozens of volunteers, dogs, and aerial reconnaissance scoured the surrounding desert. They searched for signs of a struggle, footprints, or discarded clothing. They found nothing. The ground was hard, rocky, and unforgiving, but experienced trackers confirmed one terrifying detail. There were only one set of footprints leaving the driver's side door. Peter had gotten out of the car, taken perhaps 5 or 6 steps toward the west, and then the prints simply stopped. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed him whole. The police were baffled. If this were foul play, why leave the keys and the cash? If it were an animal attack, where were the signs of struggle or blood? If Peter had hiked away to harm himself, why leave his fully stocked backpack in the vehicle? The missing details. As the investigation intensified, the focus shifted to the objects that were not in the car. The police confirmed that Peter had packed a large, durable hiking backpack containing water, a compass, and emergency supplies. The backpack was missing. This indicated that Peter had planned to walk away, but only for a short time, as he had left his wallet and keys behind. However, the most unsettling missing detail was found in the car's trunk. Peter's hobby was photography. He always traveled with his high-end, heavy-duty SLR camera. The camera was not in the car, nor was the special rolling tripod he always used. When Carol was shown the list of contents, she revealed an additional, horrifying detail. Peter had loaded a brand new roll of 36 exposure film into his camera the night before he left. This film was now missing. The detective theorized. Peter had parked, had lunch, grabbed his backpack and his camera, and walked a short distance into the desert to take a photo. But what would compel a meticulous man to leave his entire identity and his means of travel behind just for a picture? The police searched the entire area for the camera or the tripod. They even tried to find signs of a camera bag, believing the tripod might have been used to secure a camera for a long exposure. Nothing was found. The case went cold, quickly devolving into urban legend. Peter Graham was presumed dead, but his manner of disappearance was considered the perfect, impossible crime. The phone call. The story takes a chilling turn 3 years later, in 1997. Carol Graham had moved to a new state and was trying to piece her life back together. She had changed her phone number and was living under a cloud of grief and unanswered questions. One afternoon, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was distorted, faint, and riddled with static, as if speaking from a very long distance. "Hello?" Carol asked. The voice crackled back. "Carol?" It was Peter. It wasn't just a similar voice. It was Peter's unmistakable cadence, the slight, distinctive tremor in his speech. Carol, paralyzed by shock, could only whisper his name. "Peter? Oh my God, Peter, where are you?" Peter's voice came back, thin and desperate, fighting through the static. "Carol, I don't know where I am. I took the picture. I took the picture of the thing. I shouldn't have." "What thing, Peter?" "The police found your car. Where are you? The air is wrong here. It smells like ozone and dry ice. Carol, I'm trying to develop the film. I have to see the photo." His voice was rising to a frantic pitch. "The tripod. I put the tripod on the..." On the structure, Carol. It wasn't a mountain. It was too sharp. It was geometric. Carol was sobbing now. Please, just tell me where you are. I can find you. I'm close. I can see the lights. I can see the blue car, Peter whispered, his voice suddenly dropping to a horrifyingly clear tone. Carol, I think I'm standing next to the car, but the air is black here. The sun isn't working. He was describing his location, precisely the place where the car was found, but he was clearly experiencing the reality glitch that defined Peter's story. The final words Carol heard, before the line went dead, were choked with terror. The structure. It's dissolving the film. It's dissolving me. Carol, look at the picture. Look at what I took. The line went silent. The call was untraceable, originating from a single low-power cell signal that flickered once near the original desert location and then vanished forever. The police revisited the site, checking for any new physical evidence, including any sign of a geometric structure, but the desert floor was undisturbed. The mystery of Peter Graham remains one of the most frustrating disappearances on record. The evidence suggests two terrifying possibilities. He stepped out of reality, that the location where he parked was a brief, localized anomaly, a tear in the dimensional fabric. Peter stepped out of his car, carrying his camera to photograph something impossible, and that object or event simply erased him from this reality. The stopping of his footprints is the moment he passed through the barrier. The car is a beacon, that the perfectly preserved car, with all his valuables, wasn't abandoned. It was left as a deliberate, static marker. Peter's final phone call suggests he was still connected to that location, perhaps standing next to the car, trapped in a mirrored dimension where his world was dark, and his only link was the final roll of film documenting the impossible structure he stood on. The blue Ford Explorer was eventually sold at auction, but the desert road where it was found is now avoided by locals. They claim that if you drive down that road late in the afternoon, sometimes you can see a strange, rhythmic flashing light in the distance, the brief, powerful flash of an old SLR camera, taking a picture of the setting sun, desperately trying to capture the last image of the world it used to know. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the time they found the car, but never the driver. Until next time, take care of yourselves. It was January of 2024. The air in rural Vermont wasn't just cold, it was aggressive. It was the kind of cold that found the smallest gap in your jacket and bit down until your skin turned a dull shade of blue. For Tom and Sarah Miller, however, this was exactly what they had asked for. Before we begin, tell me where you were watching from in the comments. They had spent 15 years in the chaotic, gray concrete jungle of Chicago. Tom was a high-level software consultant, and Sarah was a freelance illustrator. They were tired. Tired of the sirens, tired of the traffic, and tired of the feeling that they were just two more ants in a massive hill. So, they bought a house. But not just any house. They bought a 100-year-old colonial estate sitting on 40 acres of dense pine forest just outside a tiny town called Bennington. They moved in on the 1st of January. By the 3rd of January, the first blizzard hit. It dumped 2 feet of snow over the property, turning their driveway into a white canyon. They were isolated, but they loved it. They had a massive fireplace, enough firewood to last 3 months, and a pantry full of supplies. They felt safe. But in the world of the strange, dark, and mysterious, feeling safe is usually the first sign that something is terribly wrong. The first guest. On the morning of January 5th, Tom woke up early to make coffee. As the machine hissed in the kitchen, he looked out the large bay window that faced the front yard. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, casting long, blue shadows across the pristine snow. That's when he saw it. Standing exactly 10 feet from their front porch was a snowman. It was a perfect, classic snowman. 3 spheres of packed snow, a carrot for a nose, and 2 charcoal eyes. It was about 5 feet tall. Tom chuckled to himself. He figured Sarah must have gone out late at night or very early in the morning to surprise him. She was artistic, after all. But when Sarah came downstairs 20 minutes later, wrapped in a thick wool robe, he thanked her for the new neighbor. Sarah looked at him, confused. "What neighbor, Tom?" "The snowman, Sarah. It's a nice touch." Sarah walked to the window and paled. "Tom, I didn't build that. I've been asleep since 10 o'clock last night. I haven't even put my boots on yet." Tom felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. He put on his heavy coat and stepped outside. He walked around the snowman, looking for footprints. In Vermont, if you walk through 2 feet of fresh powder, you leave a trail that looks like a trench. But as Tom circled the snowman, his heart began to thud against his ribs. The snow around the snowman was perfectly smooth. There were no footprints leading to it. There were no footprints leading away from it. It was as if the snowman had simply materialized out of the freezing air. The mimicry. The next 3 days were quiet, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The silence of the woods, which had once felt peaceful, now felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. On the morning of January 9th, Tom opened the front door to get the mail. He froze. There were now 3 snowmen. They were standing in a semicircle, all of them facing the house. But these weren't just random snowmen. One was tall and broad, wearing an old baseball cap that Tom realized with a jolt of terror was his favorite Chicago Cubs hat, a hat that he had left on the mudroom bench inside the house the night before. The second snowman was slightly shorter and held a set of wooden knitting needles in its snow-clumped hands. Sarah had been looking for those needles for 2 days. The third snowman was small, maybe 3 feet tall. It was holding a stuffed teddy bear. Tom slammed the door and locked it. He ran to the living room where Sarah was sitting. "Sarah, check the nursery, now!" They burst into their daughter Lily's room. Lily was only 4 years old and was peacefully playing with her blocks. But when Sarah looked at the bed, her breath hitched. Lily's favorite teddy bear, the one she had slept with every night for 2 years, was gone. Tom grabbed his phone. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He dialed 911. 911. "What is your emergency?" the operator asked. "Yes, my name is Tom Miller. I'm at 425 Hollow Road. Someone is on my property. They've been inside my house. They're building things in the yard." "Sir, take a deep breath," the operator said. "Are you in immediate danger?" "I don't know. They took my hat, my wife's needles, and my daughter's bear. And they're using them to dress up snowmen in our front yard." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sir, I will dispatch a deputy to your location, but with the current road conditions, it might take 1 to 2 hours. Please ensure all your doors are locked." The whiteout. The deputy never arrived. A massive nor'easter storm moved in faster than the weather reports had predicted. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wind was howling at 50 miles per hour. The visibility was 0. It was a total whiteout. The power flickered. Once, twice, and then died. The house plunged into darkness. Tom and Sarah huddled in the living room by the fire. They had moved Lily's mattress into the room with them. Tom held a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He sat in a chair facing the hallway that led to the kitchen and the basement. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind died down for a brief moment. In that sudden, vacuum-like silence, they heard it. Thump! It came from below them. The basement. Thump! Shrek! Shrek! It sounded like something heavy and wet being dragged across the floorboards. Tom stood up, his knuckles white around the iron poker. He turned on his heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam toward the basement door. The door was ajar. Tom knew for a fact he had bolted that door with a heavy brass latch. He walked forward, every step feeling like he was moving through chest-deep water. He reached the door and pushed it open. The air coming up from the basement was even colder than the outside air. It smelled like damp earth and something sweet, like rotting apples. He shone the light down the stairs. At the bottom of the steps, there was a pile of snow. But it wasn't just a pile. It was shaped. It was the base of another snowman. Tom's heart was racing at 120 beats per minute. He shouted into the darkness, "I have a weapon! Get out of my house!" No answer. Only the sound of the wind picking up again outside. He descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was a labyrinth of old stone foundations and wooden support beams. He reached the bottom and looked at the snow structure. It was half finished. But as he panned the light around the room, the The beam hit the far corner near the old coal chute. The coal chute was a small metal door, about 2 feet wide, that led to the outside. It was hanging wide open. Snow was blowing in, dusting the floor. And there, sitting on a crate next to the chute, was a small battery-operated tape recorder. It was Tom's recorder, the one he used for work memos. Tom reached out a trembling hand and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, the sound of rhythmic breathing. And then, a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like two pieces of ice rubbing together, raspy, cold, and hollow. 14, the voice whispered. 13. 12. It was a countdown. The ring of sentinels. Tom scrambled back up the stairs, locked the basement door, though he knew the lock meant nothing now, and ran to the living room. He grabbed Sarah and Lily. "We're leaving. Now, I don't care about the storm. We're getting in the truck." They threw on their heaviest parkas and boots. Tom grabbed his truck keys. They burst out the front door into the screaming wind. Tom fumbled with the key fob, hitting the unlock button. The headlights of his heavy-duty pickup truck flashed, cutting through the swirling white abyss of the storm. What the lights revealed made Sarah scream a sound that Tom would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The truck was gone. Not stolen. It was buried. But it wasn't buried by the storm. Surrounding the truck and stretching in a perfect, unbroken circle all the way around the house were snowmen. 40, 50, 60 of them. They were all standing shoulder to shoulder, their snow arms interlocked. They were all facing the house, and every single one of them was wearing something from the house. There was a snowman wearing Sarah's favorite blue dress. Another was draped in the curtains from the dining room. One had Tom's silver watch pressed into its chest. One was wearing Lily's tiny yellow rain boots. It was a wall of white, frozen, silent watchers. They had been trapped. Tom tried to run toward the circle to break through, but as he stepped into the snow, he felt his foot hit something hard beneath the surface. He brushed the snow away. It wasn't a rock. It was a human hand. Frozen solid. Tom pulled back, falling into the snow. He realized then that the strange part of this mystery was far darker than a prank. He began to dig frantically near the base of the nearest snowman. Beneath the snow, tucked into a crawlspace vent that led under the house, he found a small, hollowed-out nest made of insulation and stolen blankets. There were wrappers from their pantry. There were photos of them sleeping, taken from the foot of their bed. The midnight snowman wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a man. A man who had been living in the crawlspace of that house for 3 weeks. He was a local drifter who had gone missing in the woods 10 years ago, a man the town had forgotten. He had gone mad in the isolation of the Vermont winters. He didn't want to kill them, not at first. He wanted to collect them. He wanted to turn them into part of his family. The aftermath. Tom managed to get Sarah and Lily back inside and barricaded the bedroom door. He spent the rest of the night sitting against that door with the iron poker, watching the sun slowly rise through the frost-covered glass. When the sun finally came up on January 10th, the wind stopped. The silence returned. Tom looked out the window. The circle of snowmen was still there. But they were different now. In the morning light, he could see that they were melting slightly, their features drooping, making them look like they were weeping. The deputy finally arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning. When he saw the yard, he called for backup immediately. He told Tom he had never seen anything like it in 25 years of law enforcement. The police searched the crawlspace. They found the nest, they found the collection of items, but they never found the man. The only thing they found was a trail of bare footprints, human footprints, leading away from the coal chute straight into the deep, dark woods of the Green Mountains. The Millers left that house on January 11th, but he never went back. They sold the property at a massive loss and moved back to a bright, noisy, crowded apartment in the city. Because for Tom and Sarah, the sound of a siren or a honking car was much better than the sound of srek, srek, srek in the middle of a Vermont night. To this day, the locals in Bennington tell stories about the snowman of Hollow Road. They say that if you move into an old house in the woods, you should always check the crawlspace before the first snow falls. Because once the snow arrives, you might find that you aren't the only one living there. And if you wake up and see a snowman in your yard that you didn't build, don't wait for the countdown to reach zero.